Good morning all, and welcome to today's panel session with Doyle Clayton and recruitment agency Wade Macdonald. So we're joined by Chris Goulding today, who's the Managing Director of Wade Macdonald, as well as my Canary Wharf colleagues, Naomi Jameson and Begbie-Clench. Wade Macdonald have recently created a report into some research that they've undertaken on what employees are expecting on their return to work following the COVID shutdown. And this panel event aims to answer the questions that arise from that report, really. Chris is going to comment on the sort of management and recruitment side, and Naomi and Dan will give their insights into the employment law and health and safety law perspective as well. We did receive plenty of questions in advance, and we're aiming to cover as many of them as possible this morning. If you do have additional questions, by all means do pop them in the chat box, and we'll try, if we have time, to get round to them as well. But we have a 45-minute session today, which is being recorded. A recording will be circulated after it. Along with actually the report from Wade Macdonald. But there's lots to get through, so actually without any further ado, I'd like to turn to you, Chris, and ask you if you could take us through what the main findings of your report were and what employees are expecting on their return to work.
Sure, no problem. Thank you for having me. First thing, to just put it in a bit of context, so we first did a report about 2 months into the pandemic to see whether employee expectations were changing, having gone home for the first time. Obviously, as that's gone on for so long, we thought we'd do a follow-up and just see what the natural progression from that was. And what we found is, which probably won't be a shock to most people, but is that everybody wants to work, or virtually everybody, in pretty much a hybrid manner, with only 5% of people actually wanting to go back to their office every day. That's despite the fact that 35% of people said they find it harder to work from home, but that's not enough to get them back in. We found that people are really missing the social aspect of work, but again, not enough to go in and see their colleagues. Don't take offence, it's everyone. It seems that the majority of people are actually working longer hours at the moment. But the majority of those that said that don't seem to mind, because they're happy to use their commuting time to start working and feel like they're getting better work-life balance out of it. On a more concerning note, mental health issues are rising, which I know we knew already, but the amount is huge. Employers are trying to put support in place, but it's just whether they're going fast enough to keep up with the growing problem. Something I'd never heard of until 2 or 3 months ago, but presenteeism is becoming a growing problem for many employees, where they probably feel like they're not getting judged enough on outputs and feel like they have to justify their roles by being online from earlier till later and at beck and call of any questions that come up as the day goes on. Outside of that, 40% of people have actually stopped working to the rigid routine that they would have done when they're in the office. And only half employers have provided their staff with the equipment required to do their work from home effectively.
Thanks, Chris. That's really interesting, and I think there are some points there that some of us might have predicted following the 16 months of disruption and lockdown that we've had. But were there any particular findings you were surprised by?
There were some surprises in there, but I guess the biggest surprise for me was the first report, where we found out that people, having only worked at home for 2 months, all of a sudden wanted to spend more time at home than the office, which had shocked me a little bit. The surprises this time round, I guess, are how large the mental health issues have become. So around half of the respondents had suffered a decline in their mental health during that time. Now, I knew it had got worse, but I didn't realise how much worse. And then I guess the other one is that we were surprised how many people were working longer hours, which might be an indication of what my staff are doing, but then they are in the office. But that danger of presenteeism is definitely becoming a major issue. And if that continues, I think we'll see more written about that over the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've brought up a key point here in respect of mental health. And I'd like to bring Dan into our discussion now to consider this issue in a bit of detail. So, Dan, if we start to think about getting ready to have the workforce return to their normal workplace and perhaps hybrid working or working from home on a more permanent basis, what are the obligations on employers in respect to setting up and monitoring the health and safety, including the mental health of employees who are working from home or in a hybrid setup?
Yes, thanks, Rose. So the starting point is, as an employer, you're legally obliged to look after your employer's health and safety and welfare so far as is reasonably practicable. But this isn't an absolute duty to minimise and provide a zero risk environment at all. You just have to manage risk and do what is reasonably practicable. But this duty extends beyond the normal workplace, whether it's an office or a factory. It extends to the employee's home as well if they're working from home. So you're usually required to conduct a health and safety assessment for home working activities to identify and manage the risks posed by them working at home. But it's been a bit different during the lockdown. Obviously, a lot of people had to start working from home immediately without much preparation, and the health and safety executive advised that temporary working from home arrangements for most office-based workers wouldn't necessarily pose much additional risk. So temporary home working arrangements didn't necessarily need to have a substantive health and safety risk assessment. But I think that changes as we start to look at coming out of lockdown and the changes to the working environment after the 19th of July, and where you're going to have employees working more permanently from home or doing hybrid working, then it's going to be necessary to consider more formal health and safety assessments for their home working setup. So as a first step, you can provide your employees with appropriate guidance and materials on how to have a healthy and safe workplace. There is lots of really good information and guidance on the health and safety executive website, including all sorts of assessments and guides that you can look at. Another thing you can do, which I know that lots of clients have already done, is to have a company-wide survey or questionnaire where you gauge individual needs. But I think you need to think very carefully before implementing that, what kind of responses you might have and the extent to which your staff might come back with demands for equipment, which might be expensive or impossible for you to meet. You may also have information already about employees' needs. I mean, you may have plenty of staff who had health and safety risk assessments carried out of their workspace at the office or at the factory or at the shop before lockdown occurred. So you may also have some detail on file about their particular needs, whether they need an ergonomic keyboard or a particular chair and so on. And if so, that's something you would almost certainly need to provide for their home working space. And separately to your health and safety obligations, you need to think about anyone with a disability, because under the Equality Act, if you have an employee with a disability and that puts them at a particular disadvantage, then you will need to make reasonable adjustments to their workstation or the equipment that you provide. So again, that could be ergonomic keyboard, particular chair or something else, and that's entirely separate from your health and safety obligations. But you talked about mental health. Well, I think that for home workers, that is one of the main risks. The other one is DSE use. So just dealing with that quickly first. A DSE risk assessment would normally include assessing the use of screens, of keyboard, of chairs and so on, but also other environmental factors. So ensuring that there is sufficient lighting where the employee works and so on. Clearly, it hasn't been easy to or realistic to conduct physical DSE assessments of employees' home working spaces at the moment, but the usual position before the pandemic was that some sort of formal assessment would need to be carried out. Again, there are guidelines on the health and safety executive website for doing this, but you can also, apart from providing the guidance notes and so on to staff, you can consider video assessments as part of this in the future. And then as Chris talked about, mental health, I mean, that's obviously one of the key factors from that we've seen arise from home working, from people being isolated, but also people putting in longer hours, as Chris said. And I think there's a real issue about the break between the working day and your private time after work. Obviously, you know, lots of us, I'm sure, have been used to answering emails and calls out of hours during this time. And it can be difficult to enforce work-life boundaries. And on top of that, employees can feel isolated. Chris mentioned that lots of employees are missing their support networks at the office as well. One thing we don't yet have in this country is a legal right to disconnect that you see in some other European countries like France. So there's no formal right to put a stop to answering emails at a certain time in the day. But we do see some larger client companies implementing these types of rules. So some, and you may have read about this in the press, but some companies are stopping having meetings on certain days of the week, or telling employees they don't need to answer emails after 6 p.m. on a Friday and so on. So that's something to consider. Something else very helpful: in May this year, the government published some guidance, which is on the gov.uk website, entitled Employers and Loneliness, and it's a guidance document about what employers can do to help manage isolation, and it also has some really useful case studies from major employers as to the steps that they've taken to help employees not be isolated. So aside from this, I think a key measure for all employees in the future is going to be the role of managers and team leaders who are dealing with staff who work from home or are working on a hybrid basis. And I think primarily there needs to be a lot of clarity about expectations about when people will be available for work. Another really important point is keeping in touch. Are your home working employees going to have a specific point of contact that they can, just check in with every morning, for example? We're going to start facing issues where normally everyone would turn up at the office and you would know if somebody's missing, and then you would investigate if they didn't make contact. But of course, if we're going to have some people working from home and some in the office, you'll need to have some measures in place just to pick up any issues that may occur at that level. Managers and you as the employer should give staff guidance on how to manage their work-life balance. I talked about having these sort of parameters in place. And another key issue here is performance management. What are the expectations? I know lots of employers have said to their staff, we're perfectly happy for you to work on a hybrid basis and to do 2 or 3 days at home a week. But if your performance suffers, we reserve the right to call you back to the office full time to take steps to bring your performance up to the specific level. And that needs to be addressed at the outset, I think, and clarity in place. So I think all in all, talking about mental health and working from home, the big change has been up to now during the pandemic. We've had a lot of ad hoc and temporary measures in place where people have just got on with it and dealt with it and evolved as time has gone on. But as we look to the future and more permanent hybrid working, I think employers need to formalise their policies and the management and interaction with those staff working at home.
That's really illuminating. Thanks, Dan, because I think a lot of people we've spoken to think we can just continue as we were during the sort of emergency measures during lockdown. So it's important to know that perhaps we need to be a little bit more formal if those arrangements are continuing going forward. Now, we had a particular question on this subject, which I'd like to put to you, in relation to those who are undertaking a hybrid working model or working from home. Do we need to consider as employers undertaking a fire safety assessment for those who are working from home?
The answer is only partly, and that's in relation to equipment. So you don't have to conduct a fire safety risk assessment of the employee's home. And employees are responsible for their domestic utility supplies. So it's not on you as the employer to check that their electricity supply is stable and safe and so on. But if you provide employees with electrical equipment, then that's your responsibility. So you should ensure that the equipment's covered by an appropriate insurance policy. Now that can be arranged by you. It may be that your employer liability and public liability insurance policies cover the risk of home working and the equipment that you provide to staff to work from home, but you need to check. In some cases, employees may have home insurance that covers the equipment as well. And the equipment should also be properly maintained. So it should be checked and tested before it goes out to employees' homes, but also you should give some guidance to employees on good use and caution them not to use company equipment like phones and laptops for unauthorized purposes, and remind them to turn it off overnight to minimize any fire risk and overheating and so on.
Yeah, absolutely, and that helps them perhaps delineate between work time and home time as well, if they're making sure they're switching off all of their machines and devices at that time. So sticking to the subject of making preparations for the workforce to come back to the office and the new arrangements that they're going to be expecting to be in place, Naomi, I'd like to turn to you. We think we know that we're going to see a large number of employees thinking about a working from home or hybrid model going forward. will those employees be able to point to the fact that they've been productive for the last 16 months or more during lockdown, and therefore have kind of an infallible reason why they should and must be permitted to continue working from home on a permanent basis?
Thanks, Rose, and good morning, everyone. Well, yes, as you say, Rose, this is likely to be a very common question which comes up a lot at the moment. And in order to answer this, first of all, we need to take a step back and think about the rules and principles around flexible working. Because a request to work from home, some or all of the time, is a request to work flexibly, and it should be considered as such. Now, the good news is that the law on flexible working hasn't changed, and I'm not going to go into chapter and verse about the flexible working principles on this webinar, but just in summary, any employee with 26-week service can make a request to work flexibly. And there's no right to work flexibly. The right is simply to make the request. And then the business can consider that and refuse the request in full or in part if it can cite a valid business reason why it's not practicable to allow that request. So, for example, if there is a negative impact on the business in allowing that person to work from home all of the time. So let's come back to the question and think about, what do we do in practice if we have this employee who insists on continuing to work from home? Well, you should consider it like any other flexible working request. So the business should think about setting out clear business reasons why this arrangement's not feasible, if indeed it is not feasible. And they could come down to practical issues like needing to have somebody in the office to collect the post and answer the phones. And it could also be the softer side of things. So the importance of having more senior staff in the office to supervise other staff members. And also to build and cement client relationships that may be easier to do on the ground, so to speak. Or perhaps it could be a combination of these factors. So just because something has happened and worked out of necessity during the pandemic doesn't mean to say that the business has to allow this going forwards. The business doesn't have to show that it's impossible for the employee to work from home all of the time, just that there's a negative impact on the business in the company allowing that request. And it might be sensible and practical here to think about offering some sort of compromise and allowing the staff member to work from home some of the time. As we're discussing on this webinar, it's likely to be very common that many businesses are adopting a hybrid working model going forwards. It also would be sensible to consider imposing a trial period before you agree or reject any request. And you might say that this sounds a little bit strange because we've all been working from home for some months now, so arguably that trial period has already taken place. But that's not quite right, because the pendulum swing is now of people moving back towards the office from the 19th of July. And conducting a trial period of somebody working from home all of the time after that date will help to flush out any issues that are likely to arise in this new working world where we're working, or most people are going to be working from the office at least some of the time. So what happens if you follow all that careful guidance and think carefully through the business's obligations, and this very stubborn employee still refuses to come and work in the office? Well, if that's the circumstance that you find yourself in, it is possible to go down the disciplinary action route, but really this should be a last resort. And of course, if you are considering any kind of disciplinary action, then you should carefully consult your internal disciplinary policies and of course consider the ACAS Code of Practice. And this is assuming that the individual is not disabled or doesn't have any particular vulnerabilities. Because remember, if an employee is disabled, it may be a valid, reasonable adjustment to allow them to work from home all of the time.
Thanks, Naomi. I think that's really interesting, going to be very, very helpful to many of our attendees who brought up questions on that particular subject. Now, what happens if we flip the situation on its head and we think of those employees who have been working from home, but actually they are the perhaps slightly smaller percentage of the workforce that are sick of their own four walls or their family or their flatmates, and they want desperately to go back to the office full time, but actually there's not the office space available for them to do so?
Yeah, this is something that should certainly be considered in advance, and ideally a business shouldn't be taking what's a reasonably drastic measure in closing an office without thinking through the ramifications of that quite carefully and considering what the impact is on staff and the associated legal risks. So there's really quite a lot to think about if you're going to take the step of closing an office. but I just wanted to highlight 2 key points here to think about. The first one is mobility clauses in employment contracts. So some employment contracts will contain mobility clauses, which allows the employer some discretion in relocating staff from one working location to another, which is effectively what you would be doing if you're relocating people from working in the office to working from home on a more permanent basis. And these clauses are not necessarily something on which the employer is going to be able to rely. Even if that clause offers the employer a very wide discretion, it may be that it's not enforceable in that way. But it is a sensible thing to do to dust off your employment contracts and think about those mobility clauses as part of your considerations around an office closure. And the second very important point that I want to address is a consultation with staff. Before you go ahead and do any sort of office closure, you really should be doing a consultation with staff in line with your legal requirements. It's also helpful to do this kind of consultation to really canvass opinion on what the staff feel about this, and ideally to gain their consent to the new arrangement. It also might be helpful to flush out some issues that the business may not have thought of that staff come up with during part of that consultation process. So that's another important thing to consider. And of course, if the consultation process isn't done properly, the business is at a higher risk of getting grievances from staff and also potentially even constructive unfair dismissal claims. There are also some quite practical considerations around not having any office space going forwards. It's going to be more difficult to build team morale and team cohesion if there's no face-to-face time between staff members. And it's going to be more difficult to welcome and train new recruits, again, if the staff are not seeing each other physically in the office. And of course, you might encounter staff retention issues if you decide to close the office, and some staff, quite understandably, and as Rosa suggested, quite want to come into the office sometimes, and it could be that they decide to go and work for another employer who allows more of a hybrid working model, which allows them to work in the office some or all of the time. So on a practical note, an alternative to closing an office might be to reducing the rental space, so reducing the size of the premises that you rent or that you own. And of course, this has the benefit of some cost saving, but strikes quite a nice compromise between still having a physical place in which you can carry out team meetings or meet clients or anything else. And another alternative could be to consider hiring out office space on an ad hoc basis, just for when you need to do meetings or you want to do some sort of team activity. So there really is quite a lot to think about when it comes to an undertaking as significant as closing an office. So what I've just highlighted here are some very key points.
Thanks, Naomi. It sounds like something not to be taken lightly, and a careful plan needs to be put in place for that. We've had a few very specific questions about flexible working from our attendees, which I'd like to put to you. The first is, what should businesses be thinking about in respect of flexible working or hybrid working applications made by disabled staff?
Yeah. Well, this is, again, a very important question for businesses to be considering at the moment. And staff making flexible working requests who are vulnerable should be treated with particular care, because if not, allowing their request would have a disproportionate impact on them. The business might be more minded to allow that request. And if that vulnerability amounts to a disability, not allowing that flexible working request might amount to a failure to make reasonable adjustments, or it might also be indirect discrimination or discrimination arising from a disability. So there are quite a few potential pitfalls there. And medical evidence is going to be really important here, so it's prudent to engage occupational health at an early stage to understand what adjustments would be reasonable and helpful for any particular individuals. And lastly, don't forget about hidden disabilities here, like ADHD and dyspraxia and neurodivergent people. What impact is working from home all of the time or coming back to the office sometime going to have on those people? Is it going to be more difficult for some? Are they going to be disproportionately impacted because of the change back into the working office environment and the noise and distractions that that presents? And on the flip side, is it going to be difficult for some people to continue working from home because of the isolation that that entails? So it's quite important for the business to be thinking laterally about all of these potential issues in order to smooth that transition, reduce your legal risk, and also just to help everybody back into the workforce and to get them back up and running and productive and happy as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like it's going to be crucial just to keep in mind that there may be additional obligations or considerations for employees who are perhaps vulnerable or disabled. Now, the next question I have for you, I think is a very good one. It's come in several different forms from a few of our attendees. I think from what Chris's report has told us, and from what we're all expecting, we're expecting employers to see a large number of flexible working requests of informal or formal nature over the next few months, with most staff wanting some flexibility in their ongoing working arrangements. And there's inevitably going to be a situation in which people make flexible working requests that perhaps conflict, and we can't accommodate all of them. And so it's heartening to see that lots of our attendees want to make sure they're treating staff fairly. And so I'd be interested in your comments on that, and whether there should be sort of equal treatment across applications and across different roles as well.
It's a very good question, and I think it's absolutely correct that businesses are likely to encounter this sort of situation where there are going to be multiple requests to work from home or to work flexibly, and the business simply can't accommodate them all. So some sort of prioritisation is going to have to happen. And from a purely practical perspective, the first step is likely to be playing a bit of a game of Tetris in terms of working out who needs to be in the office when, and trying to accommodate those flexible working requests that come in. So that's likely to be the first step. And you might be able to accommodate multiple requests, but with a bit of a compromise. So you may have people wanting to work from home 4 days a week. And while you don't reject that request out of hand, it may be possible for the business to accommodate them working from home 3 days a week, or perhaps 3 days a week one week and 4 days a week the next week, depending on business demands and requirements. But fundamentally, if you simply must make a decision between 2 or more flexible working requests, then you can pull names out of a hat, which I appreciate sounds a little bit basic, but the reason behind this is that it removes any kind of suggestion that a person has made a decision and has been tainted in some way by any kind of bias or discrimination. And so your question, Rose, about equal treatment across roles. Well, again, this comes back to these principles of flexible working requests. So it comes down to what can be accommodated by the business. And some roles will simply naturally lend themselves more to working from home. So the business is likely to be able to grant working from home requests more for certain roles than for others. So in summary, it's not going to be the case that the business will have to demonstrate equal treatment of flexible working requests across roles. It will just come down to business demand.
That's very good to know. Thank you for that. And at the risk of going too far into flexible working, I have just one final question on the subject for you, Naomi. Can employers tell staff if they, for example, have requested to work from home 3 days a week? Can we tell them which 3 days that should be and when they must be in the office?
Broadly, yes, you can, as long as there's a sound business reason behind it. So it comes back to these principles of flexible working. And one of your business reasons might be that you want to have sufficient cover on all days. And as a result, there may be certain days that certain employees need to come to the office to meet working and business demand. And to flip this question around the other way, you might also want to tell staff all to be in the office on a particular day. There might be a business reason why it's sensible to have everybody on the office at least 1 day a week. For example, if you want to have a team meeting, and it would certainly be a good way to ensure that everybody gets face-to-face time with everybody else. And when you're selecting which day, if you do choose to do this, you should be careful not to select a day which disadvantages anybody with a particular protected characteristic. So to take a very obvious example, if you've got a disabled employee who has a recurring medical appointment on a Wednesday, then obviously Wednesday would be a very bad choice in terms of selecting a day where everybody is obliged to come to the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. Okay, so let's assume that you've got all of your flexible working patterns aligned and everyone's headed back into the office, having completed your sort of human Tetris of timetables. Dan, I'd like to turn back to you and have another think about health and safety, and whether, as we think about the physical return to the workplace, to the office or the shop or the store or the factory, has the health and safety rulebook been completely rewritten because of COVID?
Yes, well, I suppose temporarily. The starting point which underpins all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that your basic duty as an employer has not changed. You have a duty under law to provide a workplace which is healthy and safe and free from risk as far as reasonably practicable, but that doesn't mean that it has to be 100% risk-free. You have to do what is reasonably practicable to reduce risk. And your employees also have a statutory duty to take reasonable care of their own health and safety. So that's the starting point. But as we know, over the last year and a bit, we've had lots of guidance and regulations that have changed your obligations. And last summer, the government introduced the COVID secure guidelines, which are still in place, and we expect these to remain in place in some form after the 19th of July. Those COVID secure guidelines, just to remind you, provide guidance on 14 different types of workplaces, from offices to factories to stores and so on, giving employers guidance on how to make them COVID safe and steps that can be taken. And you know, just I won't go through them in detail, but you'll all know the drill by now. It's all about developing suitable cleaning and hygiene processes, helping staff to work from home where possible, managing social distancing in the workplace and with third parties as well, and face coverings and ventilation, which seems to be one of the more important things looking ahead to manage transmission risk. And the government is going to consider all of this guidance, and particularly social distancing, in the next few weeks, and will tell us shortly the extent to which that's going to remain in place and how much of it is going to be removed. And obviously one thing we expect to be removed is the current guidance that employees should work from home if reasonably possible. It looks like we're getting back to reasonable normality after the 19th of July at the moment. But you always had to do health and safety risk assessments as an employer, but clearly you had to do new ones, and will still have to do them in relation in light of COVID and the COVID secure guidance, and ensure, importantly, that you continue to implement your risk assessment. So not just do the paperwork, but actually keep implementing it in practice. And again, I point you to the Health and Safety Executive website, which has plenty of guidance and forms and so on to help you through these processes. And remember also at the moment, a new measure, well, some expectations were brought in by the government, where they would like employers to publish their COVID health and safety risk assessments on the company website. And certainly for companies with more than 50 employees, that is an expectation that you will publish your risk assessment. So the rule book on health and safety has been rewritten, temporarily at least. We're not sure how long all these measures are going to stay in place, but it's not just that you need to think about. There are other policies to look at as well. You'll need to think about your whole suite of employment policies when it comes to home working and hybrid working, and how to make these work well in the future. So your policies on information and data security, for example, will probably need an overhaul to deal with home working and hybrid working, the same as your communications policy and use of company equipment. And we'd also recommend specific home working policies to deal with the things that I mentioned earlier about management of expectations, performance management, and when you might withdraw the right for employees to work from home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting to know. And I think, speaking of policies, are we expecting to see even more new policies coming into place? So perhaps a more stringent policy that you must stay at home if you're experiencing any symptoms of sickness, COVID or not, or perhaps even policies requiring rapid flow testings on employees? And to what extent could these kind of policies be enforceable?
Well, yes, at the moment. I mean, certainly it's the law since September last year that if an employee is contacted by NHS Test and Trace and told that they must self-isolate, then they must do that, and they can be fined between £1,000 and £10,000 for repeated offences if they don't self-isolate. And employees who are told to self-isolate should be refused entry to work. And you as an employer are also potentially on the end of a fine of up to £10,000 if you knowingly allow or encourage an employee to attend work when they have been told to self-isolate. So your current sickness absence policy should reflect this, and obviously this is what you should be doing in practice at the moment. Now, this may change after the 19th of July. We don't know how far these measures are going to stay in place at the moment. Couple of things that affect this. Obviously, it won't have escaped your attention that we have a new health secretary in place, and sadly, the circumstances of the departure of the previous health secretary are beyond the scope of this talk, although it did bring up some interesting employment law issues. But what has changed is obviously Sajid Javid seems a bit more bullish about opening up on the 19th of July and removing measures. And there have been some other smoke signals from the government this week about potentially us no longer needing to wear face coverings, and other measures such as foreign business executives who come to this country may not need to quarantine and so on. So the direction of travel seems to be loosening of all restrictions, but we're not sure what the position is going to be on the law relating to self-isolation. Obviously, it's an unusual one because in the past, I'm sure plenty of us have slogged into work when we've been ill, and maybe at the risk of putting our colleagues at risk of catching that illness too, but it's completely different with COVID at the moment, where there is a legal prohibition on you going in if you've been told to self-isolate. So your sickness policy needs to reflect that. You asked about testing as well. Currently, it's not a legal requirement for you to test in the workplace, and I suspect it never will be, but it is recommended by the government at the moment, and I'm sure most of you know that there has been a government scheme open for you to access lateral flow tests, which you can either use for testing in the workplace or give to your employee to test at home. And that you can still obtain tests up to the 19th of July. Again, we don't know what's going to happen after that. There's plenty of guidance on the government website about implementing testing if that's something that you think you need to do. And it's still important that you consider these measures and follow the guidance, even for employees who've been vaccinated. You still have a duty of care towards them in relation to COVID. Even if they've had both jabs, they're still potentially at risk. Testing might be appropriate in some places. You've obviously will have read in the press about some employers who are saying they're not going to hire new staff unless they've been vaccinated, or they're not going to let people attend the workplace unless they can show evidence of a recent test, or they take a test on the day. If you are going to implement testing in the workplace, then there are a lot of issues to consider, and we could probably talk about this for hours, but the headline points are data protection. You need to consider the lawful basis of getting health data from your staff in this context, and what steps you're going to do to protect the data. And primarily, you're going to need to think about what your reasons are for testing and what you hope to achieve. I would always say, look at how else you might achieve these objectives without testing. You have your COVID secure guidelines. Will these not achieve your objectives? So what else do you need to achieve to actually use testing in the first place? And then on top of that, there are some hurdles, some legal hurdles. You're going to need to give employees advance warning and consider having a testing policy drafted and in place, and your internal communications about it. But almost certainly, if you want to test employees in the workplace, that is going to trigger legal obligations to consult with them under health and safety legislation. Where you want to implement some sort of health and safety measure to take precautions of this type, then there are obligations to consult with staff, sort of collective consultation type obligations. And these apply whether or not you have a staff forum, or whether or not you recognise a trade union or have a health and safety committee. And you'll need to consult about the reasons for wanting to test and the intended outcomes. And certainly that consultation process will be cumbersome, but may also help to reduce the risk of objections in the longer term and help you achieve your aims. Certainly, if you think that you might want to impose a testing policy and even take disciplinary measures or send people home if they refuse to take a test, then these things would need to be brought up in your consultation to help you demonstrate that you have been acting reasonably when you do take those measures.
That's very helpful to know and actually keep in mind, given that things still may change, but hopefully the measures that are in place will be dropped, and we'll have to get used to what can and can't be put in place. So if we've agreed sort of hybrid working arrangements or working from home arrangements post-pandemic, one question that we've had in is what can or should be paid to employees who are continuing to work from home full time in respect to their equipment?
Yes, well, So again, things might change. Obviously, at the moment, until the 19th of July, the guidance is that you must facilitate employees working from home as far as reasonably possible, and that may include providing equipment to help them do that. But underneath all of that, and when that guidance falls away, there isn't a legal requirement for you to provide equipment to staff to help them work from home. I know lots of employers over the last year or so have been providing some sort of equipment, or have given employees some costs, some expenses to put towards the costs of buying new equipment. But overall, you don't need to provide equipment. But then the question is how far your duty, your health and safety duty to manage risk in the employee's home workspace then might intersect with a need to provide equipment if you know that the employee doesn't have a suitable setup at home. So when you do your risk assessment, there may be some glaring issues that come up, and then you'll need to consider with the employee how to address them, and whether or not you as the employer might need to stump up for some of the equipment, such as a good chair or keyboard or whatever it may be. The other thing to consider, as I mentioned earlier, is disability, and that is entirely separate from your health and safety obligations. It's the duty to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act for disabled employees. So again, there might be a legal duty to provide equipment for those particular employees. Other things to consider: you may have certain employees who need special equipment anyway. They need it at the office, they may need 2 screens, for example, and then you would need to consider whether you provide that for them working at home. One other thing about costs is not everyone is aware that you can claim some tax relief from HMRC of up to the huge sum of £6 a week against the additional costs of home working. Although it's a little bit complicated, but essentially there's details on the government website, but it has to be against the additional household costs that are incurred due to home working, not the sort of standard costs of day-to-day domestic life.
Well, that's good to know, and perhaps one we should be thinking about flagging to employees. So just turning back to you, Naomi, focusing a little bit more on what happens when various new flexible working arrangements are in place. And a fair few of our attendees have asked how we manage the concerns of employees who are particularly nervous or anxious about being in the workplace, or even in fact using public transport and being around lots of people doing so.
Well, communication is going to be really important here. So it's a helpful first step is to talk to your staff and reassure them that you've complied with your health and safety obligations that Dan's been talking us through, to make the workplace as safe as possible, as safe as practicable. And on an individual basis, it would be sensible to think carefully about whether or not the individual who's expressing these concerns has got any sort of mental or physical health issue which is impacting on that anxiety. And if so, again, medical evidence could be quite helpful here to understand what adjustments might be practicable. And in terms of suggesting a practical solution to the problem, it might be possible to suggest something like allowing that employee to travel off-peak. So they could start their working day a little bit earlier and finish a little bit earlier or a bit later, to ensure that they're not travelling at peak times, and that might help to allay some of the concerns that they've got. But if there are no particular health issues and the government guidance is that it's safe to travel to work and attend the workplace, then it's likely that staff are going to have to accept that they must travel to work, and it's likely to be reasonable for the employer to insist that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of those issues that where communication is going to be absolutely vital here. Now, I can see that we've got to our scheduled finishing time. We've got a few more minutes of sort of questions and answers that we've prepared, so we will continue for a few minutes. But as I say, if anyone has to drop off, we are recording the session, and a video of it will be circulated, so feel free to do so, and you will get a recording of the final couple of questions, which we will cover off now. Naomi, another question for you, which is where perhaps having been nice and generous and having granted people the working from home pattern that they want, can we still require certain employees to come to meetings or come into the office or attend client meetings from time to time?
Yes, the short answer is most likely yes, the business is going to be able to do that as long as you can show the business reason. This is something that's probably quite important to consider when you are granting that flexible working request, because when you do that, you can make that request subject, or make allowing that pattern of work subject to certain conditions and requirements, which should include things like obliging the employee to travel to a workplace or to a meeting site as appropriate and as required and requested by the employer. And it's also probably sensible to think about other conditions that you might want to impose on people working from home. For example, it should always be conditional on the individual having a sufficiently decent and robust Wi-Fi connection, and confirming that they're not working whilst at the same time looking after children or noisy pets, for example. But if you haven't thought about this when you did originally consider the request, then a trial period would be helpful to have had a trial period, so that at the end of that trial period, these sorts of issues will have been flushed out, and you can deal with that with the employee moving forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key benefit of going through that kind of trial arrangement. So a final question for you about the practicalities of future working from home arrangements. And this is possibly a little bit of an optimistic question in terms of international travel, but we've seen some instances of employees who have a new working from home arrangement and happen to have a holiday home overseas. And what would your comments be on their perhaps employees who think that they could go and work from home from an overseas holiday home?
Well, I'm afraid my answer is going to come as a bit of a disappointment to those people who do have a holiday home. And that's because there are really myriad risks associated with allowing staff to work from home overseas. And that's because just their presence and working from overseas only on a very temporary or part-time basis could trigger obligations under local law, for example, around social security and tax. And non-compliance with those laws may be criminal. So it's really very important that the business exercises a significant degree of caution around this. And it would be very sensible to have a policy in place and to stick to it. And it would be sensible to have that policy perhaps even set out a blanket ban on working from home overseas for the reasons that I'm talking through now. You can still consider individual requests, but it would be important when doing so to think carefully about taking local advice to understand what the business's obligations are and what the risks are to the business of having that person work overseas.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's one of those rare situations in which we would advocate for a blanket ban, which isn't usually our approach. So thank you very much, Naomi, for that. Chris, I'd like to come back to you. We've heard a lot about what employee expectations are, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, please, about what you sense will be employers' reactions to employee expectations. Do you think there's a high appetite to give people what they're looking for the sake of retention and morale?
Yeah, I think on the whole, most people that we're dealing with are quite happy to adapt to a hybrid model. I mean, ultimately, the managers have been working in one themselves, so obviously they want that to carry on. Where I think we've seen some pushback, people have quickly realised that it might lead to them either being at a disadvantage when recruiting new talent or retaining the talent they've got. So they seem to have done a U-turn pretty quickly and gone and looked at the hybrid in a bit more detail. On the other side of the things we talked about, mental health is definitely being addressed. Mental health first aiders, mental health champions, etc., coming into place in most organisations, but it's not necessarily keeping up. So there's going to need to be some acceleration from that. And I think when people return to the office, we'll probably see that happen. And then the presenteeism, issue. It's being highlighted more. I think some organisations have started to look at it and say, okay, well, you won't even be able to get hold of C-suite after 6 o'clock. But in reality, I'm not sure whether that's really happening. I think a lot more management training is probably going to be needed as we move forward to address that properly.
Yeah, I definitely think that's going to be one of the hot topics that we're going to have to learn a lot more about in the coming months and years. Where there is resistance to what employees are hoping for or expecting, perhaps from their managers who might not be keen to continue a hybrid working model, what recommendations would you have to sort of try and overcome the initial resistance to the hybrid working model?
Well, I think most of it you would hope will clear as time goes on when people realise that productivity hasn't been affected by it. So as long as people carry on working properly and productivity and outputs are there, I think most people will come to terms with it. But as I said a minute ago, pretty simply put, and I've got people at the minute looking for work who haven't worked for 6-9 months and say they're desperate to get back to work. They won't necessarily look at jobs that are 100% office based. So I think there will be flex that will need to happen, or else you'll be at a disadvantage, as I said, either retaining or recruiting new talent into your organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there is a real sea change in that regard, and you know, people absolutely demand it as a standard. Are you seeing any particular themes as to what employers might be nervous of implementing in terms of the expectations of their employees?
Yeah, again, and it's mainly around the hybrid working again. So where there's pushback, we see some employees that are struggling to come to terms with the fact that their staff want to be at home more than an office. In truth, sometimes that may come down to trust. And let's face it, we've all been trained a certain way to manage a certain way, and we've all got to change if we're looking after our staff. And it's definitely a hard one at times. In some organisations, there is a legitimate reason why they feel they need people in the office every day, and that could be industry led. So in those situations, there's pushback. And in a very small minority, it's a belief from employers that not having their staff in the office is not helping with creative thinking or collaboration between their teams. And again, I think that we need to see tactics to get around that in order to push those employers forward to where everyone else will be.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. Okay, so if you could wrap us up, we've got a little bit over, but not too long. So it'd be great to hear from you just what the key takeaways from the report that you've put together would be.
Yeah, okay, very, very quickly. The first one's not surprising. So most of the changes might have been pushed upon employers at first, but is now what their employees expect. So there needs to be some change, and those that adapt the quickest will be the ones that get the best talent going forwards. I think the days of 5 days a week in an office are pretty much past us. What's probably more surprising, or what will take more work, is that people want to choose their own work patterns quite a lot of the time as well. So we'll need to see how that moves, but also people are expecting the resources to do that to be provided by their employer, even though they might be the ones making the decision to work from home in the first place. On a plus point for businesses, employees are willing to work longer hours. They just need to make sure that isn't being pushed forward into the presenteeism bit, and they're doing it because they feel like they have to, rather than doing it because they want to, or they're happy with the compromise around commuting. Employees, definitely expect more in terms of welfare support from their employers than they did at the beginning of the pandemic. We've done a couple of reports around that as well, and you can see that the trend as you're going through is both that it's expected more, but it is being provided. And the mental health piece, as we said, needs some particular attention going forwards. Outside of that, I think the way we manage has to change. So there has to be more emphasis from us on outputs rather than inputs, and more emphasis on those outputs rather than just time spent. But as I've been saying to a lot of people, the pandemic has had the biggest impact on the way that we work and the way our employers and employees will have to work together than anything else that I've certainly seen in 22, 23 years of working, and probably any of us have on this webinar.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. It seems clearly the case that it's a change to the workforce that of such scale that none of us have certainly seen before, and to some extent, hopefully not again. But you know, I think there's certainly coming out of this a significant expectation that employers need to show real flexibility and not just anticipate going back to their previous arrangements at all. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on those key issues of mental health concerns and presenteeism that seem to be getting more and more prevalent. That's about all we've got time for today. Thanks for sticking it out if you have been able to do so. Do feel free to contact any of our speakers, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of our speakers for joining us today. It's been a really interesting and informative session. As I said, a recording of the session will be circulated along with the Wade Macdonald report in due course. So all left to say really is thank you very much for joining us. If you have a moment after the session, you will get a feedback form. So let us know what you thought, and if there are any future topics you'd like us to cover, you can also feed that back in the session as well. Meantime, I hope everyone enjoys this tiny little bit window of sunshine we seem to be getting today between the traditional summer rainstorms in the UK. Have a very pleasant Thursday. Goodbye.